This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
1847 on Power Business. In our next conversation, we're joined by Parmi Natesan. She is the CEO of the Institute of Directors in South Africa, and we're speaking about the depletion of boards. And this is on the back of the fact that we've learned that 6 vacant positions are on the Transnet board, and we're wondering what the impact of that may be for Transnet, but for governance in particular, and also trying to figure out if this is something that does happen more often than you and I might know of. Parmi does join us now on the line. Parmi, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Good evening, Nolutando.
Parmi, we must speak about, the concerns and implications that come with a significantly reduced board here. It does sound like this means that there'd be certain governance cracks here, and certain things would certainly fall through those cracks.
Yeah, so, if we can start with just the fact that the board plays a very important role in an organization, right, in overseeing management, in steering and directing an organization. I would go further to say that the board plays a very high-risk role, and we've all seen examples over the years of the impact of boards not doing their jobs sufficiently, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's very important that there's sufficient diversity and sufficient skills, knowledge, expertise on these boards in order for them, 1, to understand the business properly, 2, to be able to challenge management, and 3, to be able to make the best decisions for that organization in the best long-term interests of that organization. Now, obviously, if there's a lot of vacancies, it's harder to have that collective skill and knowledge, that wide breadth that's needed in order to fulfill these functions. It's also much harder to constitute board committees, right? Because there's various, so an audit committee, for example, needs 3 independent members. A social and ethics committee then also needs 3 members. Then you have other board committees like risk, remuneration, etc. So you need sufficient people to constitute these. And yes, maybe one person can serve on 2 or 3 board committees at the same time, but certainly they can't be serving on all 4 if there's so few directors to start with, right? Because at the end of the day, we also need segregation of duties. We can't have the same people doing or sitting on all the committees. Then we might as well not have committees and have everything come to the board for decisions. It also ends up in overextending the existing board members. I think vacancies put a lot of pressure on the rest of the board that's there because at the end of the day, a board is supposed to operate collectively. And when there's a lot of vacancies, you end up having a few carry a much heavier load than they would have if there were more directors.
I must ask you, Parmi, do we often hear of many cases where boards are depleted? Is this a common occurrence, or, is this an outlier where governance is concerned, especially in South Africa?
I think it's difficult to say. I've seen board vacancies get filled quite quickly, and I've also seen others where there's a lot of time taken to fill. I think also we must also remember that there's not a set number of boards that has to serve, right? Of board members that have to serve. So a board could be 5 members or it could be 10 members. And oftentimes your founding documents, like your memorandum of incorporation, etc., would say, the board is between 6 and 12 members, let's say. So perhaps government in this case, with them being the shareholder, perhaps they feel 6 is sufficient for now. But we must also understand that the world of business and governance gets more complex, and the public sector and these entities themselves face a lot of challenges already. So I would think that there should be more of a priority on filling vacancies and fully capacitating these boards so that there's just this wide range of expertise.
Parmi, it's not the first time maybe this year that we've had a conversation about vacancies on a public sector board. Can you help us understand what maybe some of the appointment procedures may be here that might lead to certain kinds of delays, kind of the bottlenecks that we wouldn't see, for instance, in the private sector?
Yeah, so I think there's some unique challenges with regards to the public sector and the filling of vacancies, right? So in the private sector, generally there's a nominations committee that will put an ad out, interview candidates, shortlist them, vet them, etc., and then make recommendations to the shareholders to say, these are the people we feel you should appoint. In the public sector, because the government plays the role of shareholder here, it's generally in the hands of government, usually in the hands of a minister, whoever's overseeing that entity. I think that minister sometimes would need to then go to Parliament and get it approved, etc. But oftentimes it's really largely in the hands of one individual, which I think is not ideal. I think there's also political agendas at play, because oftentimes you'll find the appointments are more politically motivated than based on who has the knowledge, skills, experience, independence, and time to serve this entity properly.
I'm very keen to find out from you also, Parmi, in terms of like where do we go, for instance, to flag something like this. So we know we have organizations, for instance, such as the Institute of Directors in South Africa. And of course, that isn't necessarily a regulatory body. Do we have a regulatory body in this case, for instance, where one would be able to flag something like, well, Transnet is a very important parastatal in South Africa. In fact, we've heard over and over again that it's not performing as it should, and it's had negative, tangible impacts on South Africa's economy. And can somebody then look into it? Is there a body like that exists?
Not necessarily. I think there's various role players in these public sector entities. There's the minister, there's Parliament, there's the National Treasury that's there. In this case, there was an institutional investor who was also involved, who was raising questions about it, and that's always great because it's good for the large institutional investors to be putting pressure. But I wouldn't say per se there's one avenue that we can go to in order to raise these things.
And then I must also then ask you, Parmi, as somebody who works with directors and directorship in South Africa, are we, at a point where we are seeing our directors or being a director, being a role that is revered again? I think at some point, just to the various corporate scandals, much like the auditing profession, we started to ask questions about whether, we were appointing suitable people to our boards. Are we seeing, not even a rebrand, but a recalibration, I guess, of those who do end up sitting on our boards in the country?
I still have concerns around who we're appointing to boards, both in the private and public sector, and how we go about it. See, the challenge with directorship as a profession, and you mentioned auditors, so I'm going to make the comparison, right? With auditors, there's a regulator that gives auditors a license to practice. And if you, do something wrong or there's misconduct in any way, that regulator has the power to remove that person's license, or to remove them, and they no longer be a registered auditor, and therefore they cannot go and audit an entity. The challenge with directorship is anyone and everyone can become a director. At this point, there's no license to practice, really. As long as you're not disqualified in terms of the Companies Act, which is a very few criteria, you'll find just anyone can get appointed. And we at the IoD have for a long time been pushing for the professionalization of directorship to make it like any other profession, where you need to belong to a professional body, you need to have your skills vetted and tested, you need to actually get director designations, which the IoD offers two of. You need continued professional development like any other profession, and there's a code of conduct which you need to be held to account to. And the minute you transgress that code of conduct, your designation can be removed, which is a signal to the market that they shouldn't be appointing you to their board.
I mean, Parmi, this sounds like a very an important part, especially as we develop ESG strategies. The G in ESG does stand for governance. I'm wondering, as an organization, how you're contextualizing that.
Absolutely. And ESG in itself for us is nothing new. We've always said that an organization doesn't exist on an island, that it has to take into account its impact on the environment and on society. The G element, of course, is at the core of why we exist as the Institute of Directors. We also are the owners of the King Report on Governance for South Africa. So it's critical that we get governance right. And we've seen over the years with various corporate collapses in the private sector and public sector. I mean, we've seen the findings of the Zondo report. And those sorts of things bring out various challenges in governance, which I don't know that there's been enough done thereafter to try and plug those gaps. We've written letters to government and to even the Zondo Commission itself around these sorts of things, and especially focusing on the professionalization of directorship.
We'll be watching this one very closely, Parmi. I do believe that it's something worth, speaking about and pushing for within South Africa, just considering where we are in terms of governance, really. Now, Parmi, before I let you go here, I must then also find out from you about if the IoDSA works at all with the government in terms of boards. And I'm wondering this because of the training ability, especially within IoDSA, and just the way in which our parastatals have been managed over the last decade or so.
So we do a lot of training and advisory work in the public sector. So that's with specific public sector entities who come to us. And some of them have board memberships with the Institute. But once again, it's voluntary. So it's the ones who come to us who choose to be members with us. But wider than that, we've worked with, for example, the Department of Public Services and Administration. And they were working on a guide to the appointment of board members in SOEs, which is critical and exactly, what we've been talking about this evening. And we've put in a lot of work and effort into that guide to really get the nominations process better and to have proper skills, experience, etc., being vetted before people are appointed to these boards. The challenge, though, is that that guide was almost there, and we heard it was being submitted to Cabinet for approval, but then it was stopped. And so it makes one despondent. Not that we should stop trying. I think we need to keep pushing, but I do think there's some political motives in these things.
Absolutely hear you, Parmi. Thank you for your time this evening and sharing your thoughts and insights with us. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure.
That is Parmi Natesan. She is the CEO of the Institute of Directors in South Africa. We were speaking about depleted boards as per what's happening at Transnet, but also having a wider conversation about where we are in terms of governance with our SOEs in South Africa. And I think all of us getting to a point where we understand that there needs to be a little bit more of an objective process with how board members are appointed. And as she spoke there about, professionalizing a board. So ensuring that, for instance, people go through the right kinds of training, they hold a certificate of sorts, and should they be seen to have acted terribly, the misconduct or anything of the sort, or not necessarily performing their roles in a way that is satisfactory for all of us, then having that stripped away and then having them not sit on boards anymore. I really think it should be that precarious, considering firstly how lucrative board fees are. Many people just living off board fees, which means that it is a high paying job, but also the stakes are really high. If we think of something like Steinhoff, for instance, had the board had better oversight, had the board really taken into account all the flags, the red flags that came up there, it could have been a completely different outcome. And we know that Steinhoff is about to completely disappear from the JSE and disappear from the South Africa and the world at large as we know it. And so it is one of those situations that we really should be looking into here. It would be interesting to engage with one of the legs of government with regards to how do we make sure that those who are appointed to parastatal boards are registered with some sort of a body. Doesn't seem like it should be something that's arbitrary where any person can do so, not with the way our SOEs have gone over the last few years. And on 06198700, call in at any point to share some of your thoughts.
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.